Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. I am really excited to talk about this topic because we're not just talking about one person. We're talking about three different presidents with Dr. Sean Bienberg. So Dr. Bienberg, today we're talking about Woodrow Wilson, my favorite, Theodore Roosevelt, and William Howard Taft, who I think might replace Roosevelt, but we will see. They all had different takes
Don't get my hopes up.
Well, I'm a little still mad at Taft for what he did to the state of Arizona during our statehood. But again, I can look past that, maybe. So all three of these presidents had different takes on what the powers of the president were. What do you got for me on this? Because not that you have to convince me of Taft, but I'm exploring maybe a different favorite president to study.
Sure. So this is actually one of my favorite sections when I teach this in my Constitution class and most of our intro American government classes. We often will do this sort of Taft, Roosevelt, Wilson discussion. So this directly, it's Taft and Roosevelt sort of in debate. In fact, they start writing books and speeches, making digs at one another. But Wilson's also a part of the conversation. So you enjoy the personal stuff. This is not quite the housewives of the cabinet with Calhoun and Jackson, but it gets kind of personal. Mm-hmm. So this is obviously a period when there's some interest. This is again the kind of progressive era. There is an interest among some in expanding federal power, but also potentially in rethinking not just federal versus state power, but also the separation of powers. I'll actually start with Wilson in a sense. So Wilson basically writes, he's a constitutional law professor. He's a Princeton professor. And we talked about how he ends up as president because he gets mad about the building.
No.
Woodrow Wilson, maybe I should save this one for another podcast, but I'll just get it. Maybe I'll just say it twice. I love it too much. So Wilson becomes president of Princeton, and he wants to build a grad school there. And so if you've ever seen any of the propaganda materials from Princeton, they always have this one pretty tower on there that's like their iconic image. Like Stanford has the same thing, like the Hoover Tower.
Yeah. Yes.
So there's this pretty Gothic tower, and they have a big debate. Do we put the tower in the center of campus, or do we put it like half a mile away? And Wilson, who's president of Princeton, wants it in the center of campus. And Grover Cleveland, who is retired to New Jersey and lives in Princeton. In fact, you can go see his grave's in Princeton. He has all the alumni and the board behind him. And so they end up basically beating Wilson. And so the tower is like a half a mile away. Oh, and Wilson throws a fit. And according to some folks, this is part of what makes him say that he's going to go into state politics. I guess he decides that's less cutthroat than academic politics. The political pundit George Will, who doesn't like Woodrow Wilson very much, has this really funny line where he says, effectively, that where to put that tower was like the worst decision of American history because otherwise Wilson would have just stayed and wrecked Princeton instead of, from Will's perspective, going and wrecking the country as governor and then president. Oh my God. But Wilson is a scholar who is well known for being critical of the traditional separation of powers. He thinks it's obsolete. He gives speeches basically saying, look, the founders were very faithful to Montesquieu. So my colleague Paul Carisse, who loves Montesquieu, is probably triggered by Wilson. But Wilson has this vision where he says, look, the Constitution is this convoluted scheme of checks and balances. The president is balanced against Congress, Congress against the president, both against the court. So Montesquieu has basically created this system where government checks each other. And so he says, this is Newton. This is like physics. This is like a clock. And Wilson says, modernity is basically things working together. And he says, really, we shouldn't think about this as Newton. We should think of this as Darwin. Darwin is evolution, it's forward, but it also is coordinated in the sense that your arm is working with your eye instead of the two of them potentially like counteracting each other. And so Wilson calls for a rethinking of the separation of powers. Originally, he wants to have a stronger Congress. Later on, especially once he's president, he wants to have a stronger presidency. But he doesn't like this idea of separation of powers. He wants it to be closer to British system where by the time the monarch falls away, right, the prime minister is the executive, but it's merged basically, right? So Wilson doesn't like the idea of checks and balances. He wants efficiency on behalf of what he thinks of as like a unified people. So he's assuming there's a lot more homogeneity than the founders certainly are assuming. So that's part of his piece. And the other part is that Wilson says that we should have more and more governance done by professional bureaucrats. And so he writes a very famous essay where he says, look, the best operating government in the world is Prussia. And then he says, I know, it's kind of authoritarian and we don't want that part. But they make the trains run on time, basically. He doesn't use that exact phrase, but it's effectively, they understand the science of administration. They're real professionals. And so he says, the problem is that in America, we sort of let the masses like make decisions and they are selfish, ignorant, timid, stubborn, or foolish. And so we need to have basically professionals making more and more decisions with the people sort of, as he says, like authoritative critics. So leave the people to sort of say, yeah, you're doing a good or a bad job. But the people themselves and their representatives who are not professionals should have fewer and fewer, less and less political discretion, basically. And so he's calling for what will later get called the administrative state, right? That more decisions should be made by professionals, less of it by either the people directly or even their sort of chosen representatives. So he's critiquing that the sort of old school Montesquieu Madisonian system of power divided and distributed. I'll come back to Wilson at the end, though. William Howard Taft basically will defend the orthodox constitutional position, which is that the president should not be the primary part of government. It's supposed to be Congress. And Taft will say effectively that the president can exercise no power which cannot be fairly and reasonably traced to a specific grant of power or justly implied within such a grant of power, either in statute or the Constitution. There's no free-floating, he says, residuum of power to act in the public interest. And he says this would be dangerous. The president would say that he's universal providence and can set all things right. So what he has in mind is Theodore Roosevelt, when he's president, kind of gestures at that and then writes it much more explicitly after he's president, arguing that we should think of the president as the steward of the whole people and authorized to act for the public good unless the Constitution says no. So in a sense, Roosevelt calls for inverting the traditional understanding of presidential power, in which the president is basically an implementing force for Congress or the Constitution. And so the president has to show, like, I can act, again, on domestic policy. Roosevelt wants to invert that and say, show me where I can't act. So this has implications for both national power and separation of powers. And Roosevelt writes a book in 1913 after he's lost the presidency in 1912. And I think that's one I'm going to try to convince you we should do a 1912 only election podcast on all the characters and the interplay and the tears but he loses largely because Taft and friends basically are willing to throw an election to Wilson to keep Roosevelt out of power. So Roosevelt, when he's bitter, basically writes a book with his constitutional theory. And he says, in effect, there's two ways to understand the presidency. There's the Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln way, which tactically is the most popular Democratic president and the most popular Republican president, which is active presidents. And that's me. And then there's the version of, he says, Buchanan-Taft presidents, which are basically just sitting around waiting and doing nothing. And he says, effectively, like, my friend William Howard Taft, bless him, he's just like James Buchanan. He's no better. And Taft is not very pleased by this. And then Roosevelt goes on to say, and this is how I was president. And he goes through a list of case studies. I always point this out to my students. He says, look, this is how I governed as president. I did all these kinds of things. And he says, I, for example, had the presidency really strongly fight against California having anti-Japanese laws. And Taft says, you don't need the stewardship for that. The president has the authority to enforce treaties, and we have a treaty saying California can't do that with the Japanese. He wants to say, I deployed forces to put down an insurrection in the state. Well, yes, when asked by the governor, which Article 4 specifically authorizes. So Taft, Taft has some places where he says, Roosevelt talks a big game about all this cool stuff he would have done or did do, but the stuff he did do, it's either constitutionally allowed or the stuff he says he would have done, he wouldn't have done that. And I wish I remember the exact language, but Taft has a funny line that basically says, there were people in the room who would have kept that from happening, meaning all the rest of Roosevelt's friends in the cabinet and I, we would have made sure the grown-ups were in charge. And so he can say whatever he wants. And because he's partly aggrieved that he's been called James Buchanan. But he then wants to say, look, I'm not just saying the president should sit around and do nothing, which is what Taft, Roosevelt wants to say. Taft, as we talked about before, is more aggressive as a trust buster. Taft thinks there are, in fact, places the Constitution gives the president to act. But he just basically says, the president isn't effectively a king except when the Bill of Rights checks him, which is kind of what Roosevelt is gesturing at. So you see these three really striking different understandings of presidential power, sort of, they're musing about them. Roosevelt sort of tips at this in the early 1900s. Wilson's been writing about it for a while, but really the 1912 presidential election is in some sense kind of about these issues. Should the presidency be more powerful than Congress? Should the presidency basically be unlimited to act unless the Constitution has said no? Or should the presidency be a strong institution, but still fundamentally one that is an implementing force? So Taft defends the orthodox position. Roosevelt gestures towards sort of dictator is the wrong sense, but basically elected, and then can do whatever he wants. And the elections are the check for Roosevelt. Again, dictator doesn't mean he's marching people around like authoritarian, but the elections are the primary check, not the Constitution. And Wilson wants to sort of interpret the Constitution flexibly. He doesn't use the phrase living constitutionalism, but you can piece that together from a couple words that he has all spread out over a section to basically have the bureaucracy really do the work. So Roosevelt wants a strong president, Wilson a strong bureaucracy, and Taft a strong constitution.
So when you're talking about this, I often hear that when the president is elected, they have a mandate. Is this kind of where this comes from? Because I've heard that through many administrations, right? I have a mandate so I can do what I need to do to faithfully execute, the office of the presidency.
Yeah, as we talked about before, Jackson gestures toward that when he's back in the 1830s, but Roosevelt and then Wilson are really the two that push this, that they sort of have the idea that the presidency is a nationalized institution chosen by the people to implement a particular policy or vision. Whereas, again, Taft understands it not to be just hanging around, sitting there waiting for instructions, but that it's the presidency is not fundamentally a policy-making institution. So, yeah, Roosevelt starts that, and then Wilson will push it through with a theory called the plebiscitary presidency. Plebiscite meaning the people have all voted and endorsed what I want to do. So, ironically, Wilson later on will adopt a lot of Roosevelt's theories and vision, which leads to which amusingly then has some of Roosevelt's people jump ship to Wilson, and Roosevelt's all agreed. He feels personally offended, you betrayed me. He's why? He stole your ideas. We want the ideas, not you, man. So, the New Republic, the journal, ends up jumping ship to Wilson. But Roosevelt and Wilson, I think most sort of scholars of presidential development will say, really is where you get the aggressive claims. We have a national media now, so we can I can claim a mandate. Again, it's not totally new, but it really gets reinforced in this period. That's absolutely right.
Which president more closely aligns then with the ideas in Federalist 70 and Alexander Hamilton's, kind of claim to energy in the presidency.
Right. So this is where Taft also gets kind of mad at Lincoln, or excuse me, at Roosevelt. So Roosevelt wants to basically say, yeah, the president's supposed to be energetic. See Federalist 70 and see Lincoln, right? Because Lincoln did all these crazy things. And Taft will counter that and say, yes, but the most aggressive actions that Lincoln took are suspending habeas corpus and the Emancipation Proclamation, which are both wartime measures limited to basically battlefields. So in a sense, what Roosevelt tries to do is to say the stuff that a president can potentially do in wartime with the kind of foreign policy peace powers, we can use that in general domestic policy, so peacetime domestic politics. And so Taft wants to say, no, the Constitution very clearly has a distinction between peacetime and wartime. Roosevelt wants to ignore that. And I certainly think that Taft is on stronger grounds in saying that Lincoln is closer to Taft. I mean, we did several podcasts literally on like how specific Lincoln is in trying to justify, well, under this piece of the Constitution, I can do this. Here's my legal argument. Roosevelt wants to just basically say, Lincoln, active president, Federalist 70, energy with executive with energy. I am an active president. I have energy, QED, therefore I'm the same. Whereas, as we talked about with Federalist 70, the whole argument for the executive having energy is that it's a distinctly executive institution, right? I mean, they go through and say, you actually don't want the policymaking to be fast and decisive. You want Congress to be slow, right? So this is why I think our Federalist 71 might have been the longest one I did, where I was like, I keep beating the drum. Like, you can't just take energy in the executive and say, and therefore the president can do whatever he wants, QED, which is kind of the move Roosevelt wants to make. No, the Federalist designs the executive to have energy because it's supposed to be doing a particular set of things, which is not what Roosevelt wants to do, which is like, I looked at a problem, I saw a problem, I identified how to fix the problem, I therefore acted. Like, that's not executive as understood by the Federalist. So I don't think, despite the sort of punchy language that Roosevelt uses, he is in fact either Federalist 70 faithful or Lincoln faithful, if you think that the peacetime wartime distinction is a real thing, which I think the Constitution does envision that. So now you can make a case perhaps to say modernity is complicated. You could make Wilson's case to say modernity is complicated. We shouldn't have the separation. We'd be better if we were Britain, basically. We didn't have strong separation of powers. That's a sort of policy design trade-off question. I don't think it's consistent with the architecture of the Constitution. I mean, there's a reason Wilson says, yeah, we basically have to throw Montesquieu overboard to make this work. If you had said that in 1787, you get precisely 0 ratifications. 1789, you get precisely 0 ratifications. Now, of course, then the question I always ask my students is, which of these 3 visions of the presidency most closely reflects the actual practice of the presidency today? And here I think it's clear that our practice does not reflect Taft. I won't name names. You can pick folks from both parties in recent years without too much difficulty who basically have a, I'm going to do it, you try and stop me attitude, which is basically the core of Roosevelt's. Like, you had to show me why I can't do it rather than that I can. And that's just fundamentally an inversion from Federalist 70, from again, Lincoln, I think, from the Constitution. So I think Taft is certainly correct. And the other thing that's worth noting about Taft is basically moderately progressive on his policy views. He's a constitutional conservative in the sense that he's like, well, let's follow the Federalist 70. Let's follow the constitutional architecture. But he doesn't think there's any problem with that with policy views. If Congress wants to write me a statute that says aggressive antitrust that's dealing with interstate commerce, like, I can do that. That doesn't mean I have to sit on my hands and let, plutocrats dominate the country or whatever, you would say. So again, hopefully I will make the case that Taft is wildly underappreciated because he's very, very, I think, constitutionally faithful, but also a very subtle thinker. And I think he's also a little less, I think he's a little less willing to bend the facts in his portrayals than Roosevelt is. I mean, we talked another one about the podcast about the Lochner case. Nobody cares about the Lochner case. Roosevelt makes it this big deal, and he sort of invents it as this bogeyman. Nobody cares about it, and it's not like being used to lay waste to the entirety of the American regulatory state. And that's basically what Roosevelt wants to do, because he's mad about it, because they used a similar doctrine at the state court to strike down his first bill when he's a state legislator. He's a man who keeps grudges and who holds grudges and lets them keep going.
So you're saying he's dramatic. That's what I'm hearing, is that you think that Teddy Roosevelt is dramatic.
Yeah, and just one more while I'm defending my boy Taft here. He's got a section, Roosevelt has a section in this book where he calls out Taft for being a wimp because Taft lets, I think it's the Interior Secretary, get grilled by Congress. And Roosevelt makes it out as this, like, see, Taft's weak. He won't protect his people. Taft is having Ballinger testify to Congress, like, in order to protect Ballinger, whose reputation is being slandered by Roosevelt's buddy Gifford Pinchot, who's running around. And so it's like, yes, if you actually know the characters and the players here, this looks quite different. Taft is using this to basically defend his cabinet. Like, yes, please go talk to Congress. And like, we have the facts on our side. Later on in the New Deal, again, these are not folks that are particularly pro-Taft. Who is it? Ickes, I think, Harold Ickes does a study, and he says, basically, what Pinchot was slandering Ballinger about is one of the worst things in American history. Pinchot was better at the media, like Roosevelt is, and so he made Taft and Ballinger look bad, but Ballinger's just trying to defend himself, and Taft is trying to give Ballinger a public platform that's not just the media slamming him. But Roosevelt says, yep, there's that Taft guy throwing his people to the wolves again. I would never have done that. So, yeah.
It's literally, it's like a Bravo series. Like, these men are so dramatic and like creating all of these things. But I guess, I'm sure listeners have heard the term the bully pulpit. Like, Teddy Roosevelt really knew how to use it to his advantage. Case in point.
He's absolutely, utterly, brilliantly media savvy. It's just unfortunate in some ways that his talent for that is not always faithful to historical record. But he is absolutely a master. Propagandist is the wrong word, but he's absolutely a master of media portrayal of information. So yeah, one of the best. And again, you're gathering, I have sort of, I'll say, mixed views on him, but he is still one of the smartest people who's ever been president. I mean, he wrote history books that, he has thoughts. He can defend them. And so, yeah, he's I do not dispute your characterization of him as one of the most fascinating people in American history. I throw Huey Long up there too, who I'm looking forward to doing a podcast on. I is one of the most fascinating characters in American history. But yeah, and then it's worth noting again, this debate really matters today. What is the scope of presidential power? What is the relationship of the president to Congress? What is the relation of the president to the Constitution? As steady stream of consolidation of power in the presidency, it goes back to these debates that they had in 1912. And arguably Roosevelt wins.
Yeah. Again, I say it every time, but this is why I love American history. There's just so much in it. Dr. Weinberg, thank you so much. And he did mention Huey Long. We will be talking about Huey Long in episode 205, which comes out at the end of April 2026, just in case somebody is listening to this further in advance. So, Dr. Weinberg, thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.